Hello, I'm John Westover. I live in Orem, Utah. I'm a professor at Utah Valley University. I have been married to my wife for 22 and a half years, have 6 children.
6 kids, incredible. So what do you teach at UVU?
I'm in the business school. I am department chair and professor of organizational leadership. I teach HR, organizational development, change management, leadership courses, that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Have you ever, like, in experience, have you ever had, what you feel would be like divine guidance or higher power or intuition that guided you in making a decision that was critical to some element of success in your career?
As in pre-interview, one thing I was thinking about was just going through my education. After a couple of degrees at BYU, I went up to the University of Utah for my doctorate. And when I was, going into my dissertation defense, so, a doctoral program, it's lots is going on there and totally different than other types of degrees that you do. Very, very self-directed, self-guided. And you get through the coursework, you do your comp exams, and then you get into your research and your dissertation. And, on the one hand, you're like the expert in your dissertation, like you're that in the research that you're doing. But, and this was my experience, there was a lot of internal politics that was happening in the department that I was in, stuff that had nothing to do with me, like other professors that were in that department that hated each other, that would go after each other. And so what I knew going into, my defense, I was confident what I was doing. I was confident in my research and what I was presenting, being able to answer questions, defend what I did, all that kind of stuff. What I was very nervous about, though, was in particular a couple personalities that I knew were going to be there, that I knew were going to be contrarian just for the sake of, like, they hated each other, they were going to be contrarian, they were going to take it out on me, that kind of stuff, right? And so I get into the defense, and I was so excited because one of them wasn't there. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like the greatest blessing ever. I'm going to get away with this. I can just do my normal presentation. I can answer questions. I'm not going to have to deal with this extra dynamic of just ridiculous pettiness that's going to come from this person. But lo and behold, the guy shows up like 10 minutes late. He sits down at the end of the table. He picks up a copy of my dissertation. He starts thumbing through it. And then as soon as I'm done with my formal presentation and gets to the Q&A session, his hand is the first one that goes up. And he starts asking just ridiculous questions, attacking like the very premise of what I did. And his nemesis was my committee chair, the person who was guiding my research. And so it wasn't directed at me, it was directed at his nemesis, my committee chair. So it was totally just their interpersonal stuff. And the reason I share this is because it was in this moment where he's like attacking the very foundation of what I was even doing, very hostile. I was feeling just so nervous anyways. And this guy is just very intimidating. And it was in that moment that I felt like I just had a complete, I don't even know quite how to describe it other than some sort of like mind-opening inspiration, that I just had like a complete openness to like exactly what I needed to say to shut this guy down. And it was a clarity of being able to express exactly what my whole research project was about that I had never thought about before, that I'd never considered, that I thought actually, to this day, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was kind of genius. And after the fact, I totally ran with it. After the fact, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is how I totally need to reframe this in future publications. This is how I wrote it up, that kind of stuff. I'd never considered it up to that point. It happened in that moment because I just had like this complete mind clarity that I can't really attribute to anything other than I don't even know. It wasn't me. Like I was just nervous and scared, and I don't know what to attribute it to other than I had this moment of clarity and inspiration, and it helped me through that moment. It certainly launched me into what has been a successful career that I've been able to build off over time. And that's one example. And I've had others like that over time. I can't really describe, I can't explain, but they've certainly been powerful experiences for me.
I love that. What was your thesis?
So within my space, I got a PhD in sociology. My area was the sociology of work and organizations and comparative international sociology. And so I looked at the comparative international nature of work quality characteristics and employee motivation and job satisfaction across 39 countries. So I was comparing the geopolitical and socioeconomic factors at a macro scale that influenced why people in different countries experienced motivation, workplace motivation and job satisfaction differently, all the way down to the firm level, organizational level factors that cause differences, down to the personal level factors. Nested multi-level model of how motivation and drivers differed across those different levels. So anyways, it was a fun study. I've done a whole bunch of continued research in that space since over the last 15 plus years. And yeah, I just like, I didn't at first know how to respond to that guy in that moment. And then it just went all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the perfect answer. And I've been able to run with it ever since.
What was the general answer? What was the pivot that came to you, the inspiration?
Yeah. So part of what he was challenging, part of the title of my dissertation was around international political economy. And without getting into like the nuances of what that phrase means, international political economy, he basically challenged, like, you think your study has anything to do with international political economy? You think your study contributes to this in any way? Like he's saying things like that, totally dismissive, totally challenging just the very foundation, the very premise of anything that I did. Not even attacking the methodology, not attacking anything, just like the very premise.
Yeah, sure.
And in that moment, the very first thing that I responded to was that yes, because everything we experience in the workplace is socially constructed, and it's not just individual level factors. A lot of times when we think about things like employee engagement, job satisfaction, we think about personal level drivers. We think about personality. We think about our own experiences, our own salient motivators, etc. But there's a lot more than that. And especially from the field of sociology, we're talking about other social level drivers. We're talking about either intermediate macro level or macro level. And so I defended it by saying, no, like there really are these macro contextual factors at the geopolitical level that are driving these large scale national level differences that we see in job satisfaction and employee motivation levels, and what drives those differences across countries. And this is probably all pretty boring for people to listen to, but simple answer about how important these contextual factors are, these global geopolitical and socioeconomic differences across countries. As obvious as that may sound, that is not something anyone had ever talked about before. And as obvious as that may sound, in the world of like organizational behavior and motivation studies and job satisfaction studies, it's an incredibly, the history of those types of studies is incredibly Western centric. So all of the models that go into like trying to understand employee motivation, job satisfaction, employee engagement, all of that, it's very much Western centric, like Western European, US based. And lo and behold, when you start to look at all these cross-national comparisons, those models don't hold up. If you're looking at China, you're looking at like Indonesia, you're looking at like South Africa, you start to look at all these different parts of the world where there's vastly different contextual factors at play. And it makes for a vastly different contextual arrangement in which people experience the workplace. So their salient motivators are different. And that was the whole premise that I was able to articulate, that, now 15 years later, there's been more people that have started to do research in that realm. But at the time, like nobody was doing anything like that or expressing it that way. It just came to me and I was able to express it and kind of shut this guy down. And we got to the end of the Q&A, or at least the public Q&A, the way defenses work. And then he left and I was able to just work with my committee and answer their questions. I got through the defense. I got my doctorate. I was able to get, faculty position. I'm a professor.
Made it. Yes,
tunnel.
it was a catalyzing experience for you. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you been able to reproduce that inspiration mechanism in your career where
Good
you're
question.
able to serendipitously and randomly, it seems, right? Even with cortisol, pumping through your system because you were nervous, have you been able to replicate that insight engine in your own life to come up with even greater insights?
Good question. I wouldn't say like not able to perfectly replicate it. No, but there's a lot of research. For example, you may be familiar with, research into flow state and stuff like that. And there's a lot of research, within the workplace, workflow state. And, some of the research that I do, not directly, but tangentially connects with that research. And so those are some of the things that I try to do in my own practice, my own daily rituals, and my own how I carry out my work. And I think I'm a pretty productive guy. One of the things people always kind of comment on is like, how in the world I have 6 kids. I have my fingers in like 1,000 different pots. People are just like, how do you accomplish everything that you accomplish? I'm like, well, I'm not a workaholic. I don't like work 18 hours a day. I work a normal amount, but I'm really productive. And part of that is I've gotten pretty good at focusing and being able to tap into flow state. So I'm not sure it's exactly like that experience that I just shared. I can't say that I'm always able to tap into like these like pure like experiences of
do you think that's what it was when you were defending your thesis? Do you think that you had just unlocked flow state at that moment and we're just kind of flowing with it? Or do you think
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. That's the closest thing that I can kind of relate it to, because I've experienced things like that at other times where I'm just like, all of a sudden I'll just have like, especially when it's things that I've worked with a lot. Like my dissertation, I worked on that thing for like 3.5 years. Like I know that stuff better than anyone else. I've been working with the data. I've been analyzing it, looking at all the other literature. I knew that stuff inside and out, right? And so, my well was full of like all the knowledge and information, but I needed something to catalyze it for me to be able to like integrate it and pull it out that way, right? And that's very similar to like how people describe flow and flow state in work. I've experienced that some ways, at other times where things I've just been working on, the things that are challenging, things that, I've been struggling with and it can't come up with a good answer to. And then all of a sudden, in the silliest ways, but like I might just be walking my dogs around the park. And I have this habit of even talking to myself as I walk the dogs around the park, or walking to my dogs as I walk them around the park or whatever. I'm just kind of talking through whatever's on my mind or whatever I'm struggling with, or, things that are complicated or whatever. And I can't tell you how many times that I'm in that kind of a situation. I find myself going into a flow state, and then I'll just have like these sparks of inspiration where I'll just have like an answer come that is like an elegant answer. It's like this super complex thing that I've been wrestling with for a long time. And then all of a sudden it becomes completely obvious, it comes, then I'm like, oh my gosh, how in the world did I never see that? How in the world has no one ever seen this before? And then I can implement it, and then I can do it, and it's super useful. So I've had those types of experiences a bunch of times, but just generally on a day-to-day basis, I feel like part of the reason I'm able to be so productive and accomplish a lot is just, I get into the zone, so to speak, and I can just do a lot. And I attribute that a lot to flow.
Yeah. There's a quote that I love that I am constantly reminded of and have to remind myself of, and that is to over prepare and go with the flow.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that there's an element of that. Like people often are expecting inspiration and they don't go searching for it and do all their research first. And it almost seems like our neurology is designed such that like we expect that because we hear about all the complexity of what our brain is capable of, that we just think that all the neurosynapses and the axon terminals are all interfacing with each other all the time and making those connections. But it seems like there's the finite codification system between those synapses happening in your brain. and you have to just connect all the different iterations of the different thoughts that you have until that obvious one clicks, and that you do have to put in the reps. You have to actually code that knowledge into the database of your brain before the insight is capable of, reaching the point where it gets to the articulatable portion that becomes the insight that you get. And so anybody who is like struggling to enter a flow state or to solve a problem, part of the problem might just be like you actually haven't had enough reps at it. You haven't thought about it enough, and you're expecting too much out of the limited, databasing that you've put through your neurology in the first place.
There is no substitute for doing the work.
Yeah.
You do have to do the work up front, for sure. But yeah, that's something that I think people can tap into, as they just give themselves opportunities to get into meditative states, get into more focused states, things like that can certainly help.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a pivot for you. Now, we were both raised Mormon, and you were probably taught from a very young age, especially being in Utah, that you listen for the still small voice. You prepare yourself to feel the spirit, the burning in your bosom, right? The elevation in your heart. And I'm curious if you've ever experienced that before. Have you ever felt the spirit and known like, wow, that was the spirit that I just felt?
Yeah, what people either call feeling the spirit, or some call elevation emotion, or whatever, however you want to describe it. Yeah, I've felt that before. I think probably everyone has. And the question is, what do you attribute it to? I don't know what to attribute it to. I guess, I consider myself, I live my life in such a way that, I'm not a practicing Mormon, but still essentially live my life in such a way that I'm not sure people would even know, whether I was or not, just because, I have no reason not to. But, I just carry myself in such a way that I want to try to have good experiences, and whether God exists or God doesn't exist, I don't know. I'm going to kind of act as though there is something divine out there, and whether it's elevation emotion, just part of my neurology, or whether it's the still small voice, who knows? But yeah, I definitely felt that. I felt guided in the past. I felt protected. I felt uplifted. I felt those things.
Yeah, I think one of the areas of my own personal study in this regard is that no matter what experience somebody has, there is, without question, a physiological response that has to be registered in the body in order for you to have that experience. So the question that's on my mind that I'm exploring with most people is that where does it begin and end, right? Is there something that is coming in and creating the experience, or is it all just physiological, right? You've been primed to now feel these things, and you've got this certain neurochemical soup that's sloshing around in your brain that produces the voices that people hear and the feelings that they have. And one of the greatest indicators is the way that people feel when they're singing hymns.
Yeah.
Right. It's like,
I'm a musical guy. Like I love music. I love singing hymns,
and you feel it. Musicians feel it. They feel that flow. They feel that elevated emotion. And so I appreciate you looking to detangle this with me. Where can everyone find you, Dr. Westover?
Easiest way probably is just on LinkedIn. There's not a lot of Jonathan Westovers out there. So if you just search Jonathan Westover, I should pop up.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
This has been the Pulse Ox podcast. Please, if you found this episode valuable, give us a like on Spotify and share it with a friend.